Welcome everyone to today's event. Today is the third wave of the Volunteer Research Papers Initiative, and we have a fantastic group of researchers and papers to share with you today. My name is Zach Reimers. I'm the Director of the National Strategy for Volunteering in Australia, working here with the team at Volunteering Australia. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. So I'm coming to you from Yugger and Turrbal land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and indeed any Indigenous Australians who are attending the session today. But of course, we have people joining from all over different lands across Australia today. And so we encourage you to pay your respects, perhaps in the chat if you prefer, and to consider that events like today, it's worth reminding us that we are but the latest link in the chain of sharing knowledge, giving time, and this activity that we call volunteering. And so we have 5 presenters today. Each presenter will have 4 minutes to speak and to share their paper, their knowledge, their research. We will have a question and answer session at the end. And so we encourage you to use the Q&A function within Teams to ask the questions, or if you can't see that or can't access it, put questions directly in the chat. For today's webinar, in the audience will remain muted, and so the Q&A function or the chat will be the way to ask questions, and feel free to put them in during the session. We'll revisit them later on today. When you're asking a question, please consider if you have a specific paper or researcher in mind that you would like to steer the question towards, or if it's something that's just open to whoever would like to answer from the panel. And now I would like to introduce, or for many of you, reintroduce Professor Melanie Oppenheimer, Chair of the National Strategy for Volunteering Research Working Group. Melanie?
Thank you, Zach, very much. And hello to everyone on the Zoom today. And I'm coming to you from the lands of the Dunghutti people in northern New South Wales. As Zach said, I'm the chair of the Research Working Group, and I'm delighted to be able to have been invited to just say a few words and introduce today's event, which is, as Zach said, it's the third and last round of what we call the Volunteering Research Papers Initiative. Some of you might remember, we had our first launch back in September 2022, and our second one was in November. And today brings a total of 20 research papers that formed part of the initiative, this research paper initiative. Now, it was very important for the national strategy to be grounded in rigorous evidence-based research, as research evidence is an essential part of good policy and program design. So the Research Working Group, which was formed at the beginning of 2022, we worked all through last year helping to inform the development of the National Strategy for Volunteering. And it included interdisciplinary academics from around Australia who volunteered their time to provide essential research knowledge and expertise. And part of this was these volunteering research papers. I think we all recognise that we need to ensure that as we move forward, that there is ongoing adequate strategic investment in volunteering research. There are still many research gaps. If you want to look at page 71 of the strategy document, there's a whole list of research needs papers today address, but of course there are many more. And we need to have relevant and up-to-date evidence to inform our future actions and initiatives. Research is an ongoing, always evolving, integral part of the volunteering ecosystem, and just like oxygen, we can't do without it. So thanks very much. Enjoy today, and thanks for joining us. Back to you, Zach.
Thank you, Melanie. And so I would like to introduce our first speaker and the first paper that we're presenting today. This is a paper that comes from Dr. Stephanie Champion and co-authored by Associate Professor Tim Windsor, Dr. Leeann Mahlo, Professor Susan Gordon, and Dr. Edoardo Rosso. And presenting today, we have Dr. Stephanie Champion. Please take it away, Stephanie.
Thanks so much for inviting me to speak about our Reimagining Volunteering project today. I'm speaking from the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So our project was conducted with ACH Group, who is a provider of aged care services in South Australia, and Flinders University, and we were funded by the Office of Ageing Well and SA Health. So our project was conducted in 2021, and it aimed to better understand the experience of older volunteers in the COVID era. So focusing on identifying barriers and facilitators to volunteering for older South Australians. And I don't need to explain to this group the importance of maintaining older volunteers, so I'm going to skip over that and we're going to go right to what we did and what we found. So using multi-methods approach, we collected the views of older adult volunteers, non-volunteers and representatives from volunteering involved organisations, and we used surveys and interviews. And we found that while active volunteers were very satisfied with their volunteering experience and found that it met the goals that they had for volunteering, the people who were not currently volunteering and the representatives of volunteering organisations highlighted a range of factors that hindered volunteering, and they had some suggestions on how things could be different, and non-volunteers had some ideas for what might help them volunteer again in future. And so the disruptions arising from COVID obviously underpin everything, but I'm focusing on our other findings that came out of the discussions that presented the most important implications for practice. So starting with the importance of creating flexible volunteering opportunities. So our results highlighted the importance of volunteering opportunities and for organisations to be responsive to older adults' diverse needs, commitments and capabilities. So flexibility was key. One of the most common reasons volunteers stopped volunteering was that they couldn't fit volunteering in around paid work, their family or their caring commitments. Secondly, there was a need for systems to help to match volunteers to suitable opportunities. So a better coordinated online systems to match prospective volunteers to available opportunities can help overcome the challenge of matching volunteers' skills, interests and availability to suitable roles. And it makes it easier for individuals to know where volunteering opportunities exist and what will be asked of them. There was also the benefits of tailored marketing strategies. So combined with cultivating a participatory culture within organisations who use volunteers, this would address the motivations, capacities and availability of older adults for volunteering to help volunteers know where their skills and interests would align and convey to volunteers that their efforts will be valued. Communication channels that are clear and regular and effective mechanisms for feedback will help support and retain older volunteers. And we have to recognise that older volunteers have different motivations and expectations and goals than younger volunteers for why they are volunteering, and having strategies to recruit and retain them that are specific for them is going to help get their attention. And the two policy takeaways were regulatory requirements and expectations for training were perceived to be barriers for volunteering, and it was recommended that policymakers should ensure that the necessary regulations and requirements for volunteering are streamlined and appropriately applied, and training should be delivered in a way that doesn't create extra barriers. So for example, online training for a group of people who might have lower levels of technical literacy is a barrier. And lastly, of course, more research is needed to address the knowledge gap. A lot isn't known about what motivates older people to volunteer and why they transition in and out of volunteering roles. And so there is a gap there, and funding is needed to better understand the needs, expectations and opportunities for both young old and the oldest old of potential volunteers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's fantastic. As we all know, older volunteers are such an important part of the volunteering cohort, the volunteering ecosystem, and so many of the things you mentioned are considerations that we would all want extended to ourselves if we were volunteering as well, or when we are volunteering. So thank you so much for that. Next, we have a paper that was co-authored by Professor Carolyn Hendriks, Professor Elise Klein, and Dr Sue Regan. And presenting today is Professor Carolyn Hendriks.
Thanks so much. I'd like to acknowledge I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land here in Canberra, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And thanks to Zach and Jack and to the Research Working Group for this opportunity and for their feedback on our paper. So this paper emerged by bringing together three different perspectives on a particular kind of informal volunteering. So I'm a scholar of democratic practice and public policy, and I've been looking at different forms of social and civic action and their contribution to democratic renewal. And Elise Klein, my co-author, comes to this as a scholar of community development, and she's been working in particular on informal community-led approaches to care, particularly in Indigenous communities. And Sue Regan, many of you will know, was a former student of mine, and we've kept in contact, and her work in the volunteering sector has been significant, and particularly the observations and the research she's been driving within Volunteer Australia, looking at different forms of informal volunteering and its implications for public policy and government agencies and service providers. So before I start, just a very quick mention about this idea of, or this concept of informal volunteering. It's a very woolly concept, and in the paper what we try to do is look at a specific kind, but broadly informal volunteering is a form of volunteering that's not coordinated by an organisation or institution. And current definitions are very broad, and they include a range of sporadic and spontaneous activities that could be assisting a friend through to sort of a mutual aid effort, or right through to participating in a kind of social or even a political cause. It's a very broad umbrella for a particular kind of activity. And we know that informal volunteering provides people, particularly the young and the more marginalised, with flexible opportunities to contribute their time when they can and how they can. And this is particularly without commitments and the norms and training that might be expected in a sort of formal volunteering organisation. So this is a widespread form of volunteering, but it's not well understood. And policy and practice settings are quite weak. We don't really know how to support these kinds of volunteers, how to encourage their or to celebrate their contributions, and also when we need to sort of think about the regulatory aspects. So our paper is looking at a very specific kind of informal volunteering, which we label as community-led initiatives. And these are when volunteers give their time and they self-organise, usually in local sort of grassroots efforts, aimed at very practical solutions to collective or public problems. So, for example, they might offer emergency relief in a natural disaster context. They might produce or distribute renewable energy or sustainable food. They might deliver support or justice services to addicts or marginalised people. So these informal bottom-up relational ways of working are not typically kind of understood in sort of the volunteering world, and they're often invisible to certainly to government and some volunteer sector organisations. In the current definitions on informal volunteering, they might consider these kinds of activities under the sort of relational support or mutual assistance. But what we do in our paper is really draw out the kind of problem-solving activities that these volunteers are engaged in. They see themselves as participants, members, doers, rather than volunteers. And they're involved in sometimes the heavy lifting of public policy or governance when the market or government has failed, or where there's a gap potentially in civil society. These initiatives are obviously not new, and there's diverse communities around the globe that have long developed solutions to collective problems. And indeed, Australia has a rich history of community-led problem solving. Our First Nations people and the community action scene in the war years. What we do in the paper, though, is really try to draw out some of the public policy implications of these initiatives, because we've all, particularly in the bushfires and COVID and the floods, seen the well-meaning initiatives of communities that step up, but they can sometimes rub against and cause tensions with formal volunteering organisations and government programs. So in the paper, we kind of tease out some of these, the public policy opportunities here. So, for example, these are spaces where people can get involved, they can build connections and offer alternative ways of contributing. They can generate very innovative solutions to complex problems, and they can disrupt, conventional policy frames and challenge existing power. But they can also bypass existing opportunities for state funding, but also accountability. And our paper really explores some of these opportunities and tensions. And we draw on some empirical work that I've conducted with colleagues in the US that are really trying to unpack what do citizens do in these spaces, and what is the way they try to contribute, what motivates them, and how do they work with other organisations, civic organisations and more formal organisations of the state. Our paper kind of wraps up by calling on frameworks and the strategy particularly to think about ways of not stifling informality, that this is actually a source of creativity and citizen agency, and we need to be mindful that this is a growing area of volunteer or what I might call civic action. We call on more research. We really don't know much about these spaces of public engagement and volunteering. And we ask for greater attention, I guess, in government policies to how to both empower communities, but also to make sure that we're not excluding particular communities from these spaces as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And informal volunteering and all diverse forms of volunteering is such an important thing for us to keep in mind as we go forward. So next we'll be introducing Dr. Anthony Fee.
Hi everyone, thank you Zach. Yeah, can I also acknowledge and pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm here at UTS campus in Sydney. And look, this research paper that I've developed deals with just one group of volunteers, a particular group of volunteers, international development volunteers. In short, these are highly skilled professionals who take time away from their career to go overseas for sort of a long-term volunteer assignment, usually 1 or 2 years, on a development-focused project using a sort of a model of capacity strengthening, working really closely with local counterparts in other countries. And it looks at one aspect of the experiences of those development volunteers, not the downstream impact that they have for the local communities, although that's most important, obviously. This paper really summarises the literature relating to the impact on those individual volunteers, in other words, the professional and personal impacts in terms of developing skills and dispositions and understanding the global context and so on. And that sort of upstream focus rather than the downstream focus is important for a couple of reasons. One is because there's such a huge opportunity cost associated with that sort of volunteering. These are really highly paid individuals. They're sort of removing themselves from their professional networks and social supports and income stream, of course, and sort of sacrificing a lot to fulfill their volunteering sort of commitments. It's also important because the distinctive model that many of the volunteer agencies that use this form of development volunteering actually centres on the idea of reciprocity and equality. In other words, the volunteer working closely and collaboratively with counterparts in the local culture, embedded in the community, embedded in host organisations, and very much sort of a equal partnership, two-way flow of knowledge, sort of valuing all sorts of knowledge, including Indigenous knowledges. And of course, that means that not only is not just is the community sort of the recipient of the volunteer's largesse, but the volunteer also benefiting from the experience is actually important to sort of reinforcing that equality. So the host communities see that they're having a contribution to the volunteer, not just sort of one-way recipients of aid and development. And so the article sort of summarises it in, it's no sort of surprise, I guess, that it is actually a really expensive, or it can be a really expensive learning environment when they're well managed. So the article summarises some of the aspects that contribute towards sort of what volunteers develop during their time away, the sorts of impacts it has on them in terms of skill development, in terms of their career post-volunteer assignment as well. And I guess sort of the conditions and the nature of the role, including the model itself that contributes to those and sort of the long-term impacts. And the paper sort of summarises 20 years of research in this area, but it parallels quite closely with a lot of research I've done, and indeed an ongoing study I'm doing at the moment, looking at a group of 50 volunteers that I'm tracking sort of longitudinally. It's been going for 4 years now. It will continue for another 3 years, looking at sort of before, during and after their assignment and sort of how that progresses in the future personally and professionally. I guess from a perspective of policy in terms of what does it all mean, one of the important things I think is probably the challenges that the volunteers have when they finish their assignment and want to sort of return to the workforce or return to apply the new skills and knowledge that they developed during their assignments. Many of them do have really productive outcomes. They are able to transition. Many of them work in international aid and development professionally in a paid role in the future. In fact, for many of them, that's the purpose for undertaking the assignment in the first place. Some of them undergo sort of pro-social transitions. They've come from a corporate sector. They now want to sort of get the meaning and apply the skills that they developed during their assignment and sort of shift to work in community sector when they get back to Australia. Many others are sort of inspired to take up additional study. There's also a number of them who are looking for opportunities to apply their skills with community organisations, right? And I think that's where it's really valuable for the members of Volunteering Australia to sort of think about this potentially really rich body of motivated, engaged, with very strong agency, to be honest, a lot of the volunteers when they finish their assignment, and how might they take advantage of some of those skills and provide an outlet for some of those skills. And so the policy suggestions are made around a couple of areas. One is sort of communicating what is distinctive about international development volunteering, and in particular how that model of development volunteering that I spoke about is quite distinctive from volunteerism, sort of unskilled, supply-driven and demand-driven volunteering, which for many prospective employers, of course, that's their view of what international volunteering is. So when people return with that on their CV, there's often misconceptions about what it actually is and therefore what the experience is like and what the volunteers can contribute. So helping sort of communicate that, it's particularly difficult for volunteers who have worked in small domestic NGOs that don't sort of have really strong brand recognition in other countries, or where there may be very strong language differences, and so it's hard for prospective employers to sort of connect with them. I also think there's potential opportunities for connections between sort of domestic-based community organisations to connect with the international volunteer agencies that oversee a lot of these development volunteer programs. For a couple of reasons. One is to sort of facilitate that pathway that I was talking about. So many volunteers are looking for opportunities for community organisations that share their values and interests, obviously their availability as well, but also the chance to apply some of sort of the global knowledge and skills that they've picked up, but also to learn from how those volunteer agencies manage their volunteers in really unusual circumstances. A lot of pre-departure training, a lot of in-country support. So for domestic community organisations that have volunteers working with culturally diverse communities or remote located communities, I think there's great opportunities there to learn from the really rich experiences and support that they get from volunteer agencies. And I must be honest, coming from a business school and working with corporate organisations, the agencies that I've been really strongly involved in, the volunteer agencies, tend to manage their international volunteers more effectively than many corporates do. And that's sort of the comment from many volunteers as well. So I guess that's sort of a summary of that research briefing, and I really would encourage you to read it and to contact me if you want to know more about that.
Thank you so much, Anthony. There's a lot in that summary there, a lot of fantastic stuff. And I've seen some comments come through in the chat as well, so I encourage people, if you're thinking of a question now, please use that Q&A feature. If you can't see it and you have a question for Anthony or any of the other presenters today, please put it in the chat. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jack McDermott.
Yeah, thank you, Zach, and hi, everyone. So in this paper, I reviewed research on the effects of volunteering on mental health quite broadly. And in today's presentation, I just wanted to briefly outline the main findings and then discuss 5 key policy implications of this research. So firstly, volunteering is associated with better mental health. Numerous studies have found that volunteering correlates with improved life satisfaction, happiness, self-esteem, and perceived mental health. Volunteering supports mental health by creating opportunities for social interaction and meaningful social roles, which instills a sense of purpose and belonging. Research indicates that older people and people with lower life satisfaction may experience the greatest mental health benefits through volunteering, and the type of volunteering activity people do does not seem to significantly affect mental health outcomes. So studies that looked at mental health outcomes across sectors or role types did not find significant differences. So any type of volunteering can be beneficial. However, the extent of mental health benefits from volunteering does depend on the motivations of volunteers and their satisfaction with the volunteering experience. Volunteering can also support mental health recovery, for example, through participation in social prescribing programs and in peer support roles. So these insights kind of broadly indicate that volunteering is generally beneficial to mental health. However, research does also indicate that in certain situations, participating in volunteering activity can pose mental health risks, and these may be different from those faced by paid staff. Volunteers can be more likely to experience role confusion and less likely to receive ongoing support from their organisation, for example. Volunteers also make extensive contributions to the mental health workforce in Australia across various areas, including suicide prevention, new parent assistance, addressing loneliness and social isolation, family violence response, and many other areas. Looking ahead, I also identified a few key priorities for future research. Firstly, youth volunteering in mental health, as most of the studies that I found focused on older populations. Secondly, the mental health benefits for people with disability and those experiencing mental ill health were not often included in studies. And finally, a majority of studies focused on formal volunteering through an organisational group, but the same benefits should extend to informal volunteering in the community. And so research that compares formal and informal volunteering might better illuminate this. Based on this research, I identified 5 key policy implications which could help maximise the mental health benefits of volunteering. Firstly, effective promotion and resourcing of volunteering, which could include resourcing of volunteer programs to accommodate a larger number of volunteers, and also to remove barriers to inclusion for marginalised groups. Secondly, closer attention to volunteer satisfaction and motivations would help to maximise the mental health benefits of volunteering. Thirdly, the creation of more opportunities for people recovering from mental ill health, in particular, the development and evaluation of social prescribing programs. Fourthly, better training and support programs to manage mental health risks to volunteers, especially those in high-risk settings. And finally, better recognition of and support for the role of volunteers in the mental health workforce in government policy. In conclusion, available research highlights the positive impact of volunteering on mental health, emphasising the need for strategic policies and that promote and support volunteering activities. By prioritising mental health and ensuring appropriate resources, training and support, we can better leverage volunteering to strengthen mental health outcomes for individuals and communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. And I'm sure people already seeing the links between some of these papers as well and the talking points that are being discussed today. So next on our agenda, we have a paper by Carissa Jedwab, and speaking today is Cooney Carrington. Cooney?
Thank you, Zach. Hello, everyone. I'm joining from the Bunurong land in Victoria. I would like to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I work as a volunteer recruitment and training coordinator at AIMS Australia. Our organisation works alongside people who have arrived as migrants and refugees to facilitate their successful settlement in Australia. This paper looks at implications and benefits of volunteering for culturally and linguistically diverse communities or CAL communities. Current volunteering participation rates among migrant cohort and barriers to volunteering inclusion. Key insights include there's a strong social and economic case for including CAL communities in formal volunteering within organizations. It has been shown that this inclusion leads to positive outcomes, such as improved social and cultural integration, which is directly contributes to the successful settlement of new arrivals. The data indicates that skilled visa holders are more likely to engage in volunteering compared to other visa groups. However, all migrants, both recent and non-recent, are less likely to volunteer through organizations compared to those born in Australia. Barriers to access formal volunteer positions are similar to those faced in the labour market. For example, English language proficiency, local work experience, and logical barriers such as access to transport and affordable childcare. Limited knowledge about volunteering is a major inclusion barrier for CAL communities. Formal volunteering, as understood in Australia, is not a familiar concept in some languages or cultures, or the practice may look very different. Recruiting and supporting volunteers from cow backgrounds can be a challenge for VIOs. Research suggests that 86% of VIOs need more volunteers but lack the resources to recruit individuals from cow backgrounds. In terms of policy and practice implication, policymakers and the volunteering ecosystem can support VIOs through education and resourcing to implement and evaluate these 3 inclusion strategies. First, VIOs should review their volunteer recruitment processes to make them more flexible and accessible. Building cultural awareness within VIOs and providing culturally appropriate resources will help engage cow individuals in mainstream volunteers' role. Second, if volunteers from cow backgrounds intend to volunteer as a pathway to paid employment, VIOs should support them to maximize the employment-related learning gained through volunteering, such as providing professional networking opportunities. And the third one, volunteers from cow backgrounds must be empowered to volunteer safely within the volunteering ecosystem and VIOs. Accessible education on volunteer rights and responsibilities is essential to achieving this. In terms of gaps in knowledge and future research possibilities, so further research is needed, particularly considering the challenges faced by temporary residents and new migrants in accessing employment and dealing with social isolation. Additionally, studying the impact of recruiting and supporting volunteers from cow backgrounds on VIOs, especially during the pandemic, would provide valuable insights into their transformations and needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cooney. We're about to turn to our Q&A. First, I'd just like to thank all of our presenters and researchers and co-authors today. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A feature or in the chat. And I'd just like to remark that I love how today's sessions, no matter which angle you're coming at it from, whether you're interested in the research or you're a manager of volunteers and you want to improve your recruitment, whatever it is you're doing, there's findings today that are really practical to whatever angle you'd like to take on it. So I'd like to open up, I'll be throwing to Jack for the questions, but I note the first question is for Jack. So I want to ask our own Jack McDermott directly, which is, has there been research in regard to volunteers who have significant mental health issues bringing their ill health into volunteer organizations that are not trained or equipped to support them? So asking about a potential gap in the expertise of the volunteer involving organizations. Do you know of any research that examines that angle?
Yeah, well, in terms of what I cover in my paper, it's mostly on the mental health effects of participation in volunteering, so less a focus on how VIOs might consider the mental health of their volunteers. But there, in terms of supporting mental health within volunteer involving organizations, there is a previous volunteering research paper that's on the National Strategy website at the moment by Adam Nebs on psychological hazard management in regional volunteer involving organizations. And it does discuss some of the strategies that VIOs might use and the responsibilities they have to promote mental health within VIOs. And then I would also say I'm not sure exactly that there's a lot of research on how VIOs involve volunteers with lived experience of mental unwellness, although that might be a really interesting area for future research. But there are definitely a lot of VIOs that specialize in inclusion, and they have some really great resources available online as well. But yes, thank you for the question. I hope that's helpful.
And I'll put you on the spot again, Jack, and ask if you can see if there are any more questions coming through for us. I can see here a question for Cooney and Carissa, which is, Cooney, did any of the research identify ways to overcome the barriers that you discussed of awareness of volunteering opportunities by called communities?
So I mean, from memory, I don't see the research mention much, but the research also talking about building cultural awareness within how to build a cultural awareness within the VIO. For example, use the proactive and sustained approach to engage Khao, like people from Khao backgrounds. For example, at AIMS Australia, we run information sessions. At the volunteer program that's supported by community liaison. This is like the position at AIMS that who provide cultural and language support. So basically, yeah. So sorry, I want to say it again. Sorry, I'm too excited. So yeah, so the research didn't really mention, but the research give example how the VIO who engage volunteer from Khao background. The strategy, how the VIO who engage volunteer from Khao background use. So then, maybe other organization can utilize the same strategies. Yeah, which make the volunteer program more accessible and also like appropriate with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Yeah.
Thank you. And I was wondering, Anthony, if you had anything that you wanted to contribute on this, given that your research has also looked into that crossover between different cultures.
Well, Zach, just that, as I said, many of the return volunteers, the international development volunteers, when they finish their assignment, are looking for opportunities to apply their new knowledge and skills and global connections that they have when they get back. Many of them take off overseas again. I guess many of them take up additional or follow-up volunteer assignments, either in the same country or a different country again. But I do think there's great opportunity for volunteer-involved organisations that are working with culturally and linguistically diverse communities in Australia who want people who are culturally intelligent, because the nature of the experience that the development volunteers have is very different to most corporate expatriates and very different to the short-term supply-based sort of volunteerism type models. So there's a great resource there potentially that could be used. So yeah, and I know some of the ones I'm sort of monitoring at the moment have spoken about still 2 years now after finishing their assignment, looking for opportunities that they think fit their skills and their timetable and other sort of variables as well. So there is the interest there, there's motivation, there's, as I said before, a much greater sense of agency that they take away from their time in country, and an understanding sort of the not-for-profit ecosystem. For many of them, that was sort of the introduction to that sort of environment for them. They'd come from a corporate or a government background. So there's an appetite there for it. It's just a matter of sort of the connections that I think actually could be facilitated to enable those pathways to be more fluid.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Jack, do we have another question coming in?
Yes, there's another question here for Stephanie, and it's, did you find any feedback on how volunteers in health have been able to motivate themselves to return to their volunteering in health role? So yeah, really a question if there's anything in your paper on the health sector in particular, and also on the motivations of returning volunteers, which is quite an interesting area, I think.
Because this was a COVID era research, that was definitely a factor that came up. People being very concerned about returning to volunteering opportunities, given the issues or the risk of COVID. And it's sort of entwined with the regulatory issues as well, because with COVID came a whole bunch of new regulations, and organisations were very concerned about protecting the health of their volunteers. And so they introduced a lot of new regulations, or they just flat out said no volunteers. It wasn't worth the risk, which is really damaging for the organisations that were using volunteers, because they were there for a really important reason. So there's a little bit mentioned about health in relation to COVID in the paper, but actually there's probably more in the original report, which if you go to the paper on the website with the links that have been shared, right down at the bottom, it does say where to find the original report, which is a full 43 pages long, of which expands a little bit more on aspects relating to health factors that might prevent somebody from volunteering. So I hope that you can find something in there if you're interested in knowing more about it.
Thank you for that answer. I see that we have a question here for Carolyn as well, which is thinking of the informal volunteering, the community-led volunteering. Melanie's asking if you've considered looking at that within a larger historical framework and considering that many of the organizations that we know today have come from that type of community-led or perhaps informal starting point. Has that been something you've looked into?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I know Melanie's commented on earlier, and it's a great point because, you know, some of the largest charity and formalized volunteering organizations have their roots in a very local, place-based or grassroots effort. That said, I think there are different kinds of life cycles in this space. I think some organizations may even start in a very formal space, and a spin-off might be a more grassroots effort. I know the Red Cross, for example, is doing trying to do more grassroots work and getting into a more informal sort of structures working locally. And also some of the work that we've been doing, for example, in employment services, some organisations intentionally try and keep their scale or the formality small or informal. It serves the kinds of people they're working with. So in employment services organisation that I'm thinking of, or very sort of citizen-led effort, they intentionally kept the organisation or the group small because they were able to then work with the people that they were trying to help, which was usually cognitively impaired people, so they could work at their pace. The bigger the organisation, the more structure, it didn't seem to fit with what they were trying to do, the kind of particular group of marginalised citizens they were trying to help. So I think there is definitely a larger historical story here, but we've been particularly interested in the contemporary picture at a time when trust in government and trust in large civic organisations is lower than it's ever been. So these bottom-up community efforts sometimes step into a space of deep distrust of institutions. And how do those different kinds of organisations and grassroots initiatives work in this contemporary moment?
Jack, do we have any more questions coming through in the chat?
We do. So I have a question here for another question for Kuni. Does having a workplace volunteering program help to reduce barriers to get involved for people from COLD backgrounds? Yes, I'm wondering if there was anything in the paper on workplace or employee volunteering and its relationship with inclusion.
Yes, yes, the paper actually mentioned about, you know, like, yeah, having a workplace volunteering program helps reduce barriers to get involved for people from CAL background. For example, talking about, you know, like the data entry or customer service role. So yeah, and also like so because the main barrier for people from CAL background to get a job in Australia is because they don't have the referee or they don't have local experience. So then, you know, like BIO can think about what role that can support them in getting a job or getting a referee. Yeah, so and then from the research paper and also from the experience of our organization, so the role that's suitable for people from CAL communities are, you know, like people want to work in an office, and the role of customer service and data entry would help them to gain that experience, and then can also practice their English language skill as well while they're volunteering. Yeah, so I hope that answered the question. And also, you know, the question also mentioned about, is there a clear option and support within the family environment? Yeah, so the VIO will need to thinking about to make the volunteer program more inclusive. For example, the recruitment process, you know, think about maybe have to consider instead of doing one-on-one interview, the research paper mentioned about may have the information session instead, because this could help, you know, people who don't have confidence in speaking English, because when they are in a group, they will have more confidence Yeah, and also consider having clear position description, having it in plain English, or consider translate it into other languages that will help engage more people from Khao backgrounds as well.
Yeah, even just a few small, simple things like learning some greetings and incorporating things like that of the volunteers that you have either engaged in your team or that you wish to engage. It enriches your knowledge, it helps people feel more engaged, and there are small overtures that you can make that help people have a better experience, along with the other more substantive things that you mentioned as well. And so I believe that's the end of the questions, unless someone has a last second one that you want to put in the chat. I think that might be it. So thank you so much for your questions. Great set of questions there for all of our researchers, and those you can always find out more on the website. I'll be sharing the link again in just a moment. So for now, I would like to just touch on an update for the national strategy for volunteering. So you may be aware the Volunteer Research Papers Initiative and other research projects, some of these came out of the development of the National Strategy for Volunteering and have informed part of the strategy, which has had a really strong research base and strong engagement from the research working group and academics and researchers and practitioners within volunteering. Earlier this year, we launched the National Strategy for Volunteering in Australia, which I'm sure most of you know, but just in case any of you don't, and many of those attending today contributed to its development. So thank you for your efforts, and thank you to those who have already taken action to support the strategy. I've recently come on board as National Strategy Director, and we are now in the first year, the establishment phase. So this is the first year of the 10-year plan for the strategy, which runs until 2032. So the establishment phase, what is it? It has 4 key components. There's an action plan, a monitoring and evaluation framework, which I'm sure is of interest to many researchers. There's a model for shared accountability and a blueprint for governance. So we'll be working with people collaboratively throughout all the volunteering ecosystem on these throughout the year, and we encourage you to be involved. I'm going to paste some contact details in the chat now, so please subscribe or contact us so that we can share our upcoming work with you. And that URL for those who are audio only at the moment is volunteeringstrategy.org.au. So in the meantime, while we're working on those 4 key items I mentioned, we'll be laying out our plans to engage the volunteering ecosystem in the work going forward, and we'll be working to make the strategy more accessible, including elements like the research papers that came out. We want to revisit those and highlight those and make sure we share the value of today's set of research papers, as well as everything else that's come out to date in the strategy. So we know those involved in volunteering are often time poor and would benefit from practical summaries and different ways to engage with the content. So we'll be delivering resources to help with that, to help people align their volunteering and their volunteer engagement with the national strategy, as well as sharing successes where people have already worked to help achieve the strategy, or where their business as usual is a great example we can share of the ways to ensure volunteering is at the heart of Australian communities. Alongside this outreach and resources, we'll be making some changes to the website, including the research page where you'll find today's papers and the previous 2 tranches of volunteer research papers. So on that note, I will wrap up today's session. I'm sure people are keen to find out more, so I encourage you to download the papers from the research page of the National Strategy website, which I've just linked in the chat, volunteeringstrategy.org.au/research. The papers are live on the website right now, and a recording of this session will be made available soon as well. If you're interested in volunteering research, in addition to today's papers and the previous 2 rounds, you might also want to consider the National Volunteering Research Network. So this is a group of researchers, academics, staff from volunteering peak bodies, and other people who are interested in volunteering research and practice. So I'll put an email address in the chat now if you're interested in finding out more, which is research@volunteeringaustralia.org. And so on that note, thank you all for today. Thank you especially to the researchers and presenters. Thank you to Melanie Oppenheimer and the Research Working Group. Thank you to the Volunteering Australia team who made this possible behind the scenes. And thank you to you in the audience as well for your attendance, your energy, your enthusiasm, and your interest today. Cheers.